the youngest child's face. The photograph arrived at Maya Richardson's studio on a cold January morning, carefully wrapped in acid-free tissue paper and nestled inside a padded envelope. Maya ran a specialized photo restoration business in Brooklyn, and she had seen thousands of damaged images pass through her hands: Civil War tintypes, faded Victorian portraits, water-stained family albums. But there was something about this particular package that made her handle it with extra care. The return address indicated it had been sent from Charleston, South Carolina, by a woman named Grace Thompson. The accompanying letter was brief. "This photograph has been in my family for generations. It's the only image we have of my great-great-grandmother's family, but it's badly damaged. I'm told you're the best at what you do. Please help me see their faces clearly." Maya carefully unwrapped the photograph and held it under her magnifying lamp. The image was indeed in poor condition. The emulsion had cracked and peeled in several places. Water damage had created dark stains across the bottom third, and someone had attempted a crude repair years ago that had only made things worse. But beneath the damage, Maya could make out the ghostly forms of 7 people arranged in front of what appeared to be a wooden house with a wide front porch. The photograph was mounted on thick cardboard backing, and on the reverse side, written in faded pencil, was a date: June 1906, Charleston. Below that, someone had written a series of names, though several were illegible due to water damage. Maya photographed the damaged original with her high-resolution camera, creating a digital master file that she could work with without risking further harm to the fragile physical artifact. Then she settled into her workstation, opened her restoration software, and began the painstaking process of digital repair. She started with the structural damage, carefully cloning undamaged sections of the photograph to fill in the cracks and gaps, smoothing out the water stains, removing the discoloration from the failed earlier repair attempt. This was the technical work, the digital surgery that required precision and patience. Maya had been doing this for 15 years, ever since graduating with a degree in art conservation, and her hands moved with practiced confidence across her tablet. After 3 hours of work, the basic structure of the image was restored. Maya could now see the composition clearly. A family of 7 standing on the porch of their home. The adults wore their Sunday clothes, the man in a dark suit with a high collar, the woman beside him in a white blouse and long skirt. 5 children ranged from what appeared to be a teenager down to a small child of perhaps 4 years old, sitting on the porch steps. Maya saved her work and stretched, rolling her shoulders to ease the tension from hours of concentrated focus. Tomorrow, she would begin the detailed work of restoring the faces, bringing clarity to features that had been obscured by time and damage. Maya returned to the photograph the next morning with fresh eyes and her strongest coffee. The structural restoration was complete. Now came the delicate work of recovering the details that made these people individuals, rather than shadows. She began with the adults, carefully enhancing contrast and sharpness to reveal the lines of their faces, the texture of their clothing, the expressions in their eyes. The man appeared to be in his mid-30s, with a strong jaw and serious expression. He stood with his hand resting on the shoulder of the woman beside him, a gesture of both protection and partnership. The woman's face showed intelligence and determination, her gaze direct, her posture upright, despite what must have been the exhaustion of managing a household and 5 children in 1906 Charleston. Maya moved to the children, working from oldest to youngest. The teenager, a boy of perhaps 15, stood at his father's other side, already nearly as tall as the man. Next came 2 girls who appeared to be around 12 and 10, their hair braided and adorned with white ribbons. Then a boy of about 7, grinning despite the formal occasion, one front tooth missing. Finally, Maya zoomed in on the youngest child, a little girl sitting on the porch steps, her small hands folded in her lap. The damage to this section of the photograph had been particularly severe, with a large water stain obscuring most of her face. Maya worked carefully, layer by layer, removing the discoloration and enhancing the remaining detail. As the child's features began to emerge from beneath the damage, Maya paused. Something about the face seemed unusual. She increased the magnification, focusing on the area around the eyes and forehead. Her breath caught. Even through the remaining grain and imperfection of the old photograph, even accounting for the limitations of 1906 camera technology, what Maya was seeing didn't make sense. The child's face showed characteristics that seemed medically impossible for the era, or rather characteristics that wouldn't be understood or diagnosed for another 50 years. Maya sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She had restored thousands of photographs, seen every kind of facial feature and physical characteristic that human genetics could produce. But this was different. This was something that the family in 1906 wouldn't have had words for. Something that would have made this child stand out in ways both remarkable and potentially dangerous in the segregated South. She picked up her phone and called Dr. James Wright, a colleague who taught medical history at Columbia University. James had helped her before, when historical photographs showed signs of medical conditions, providing context and confirmation for what the images revealed. "James, I need you to look at something," Maya said when he answered. I'm working on a photograph from 1906, and I think I'm seeing signs of a genetic condition in a child's face. But if I'm right, this condition wasn't even identified until the 1950s. Dr. James Wright arrived at Maya's studio that afternoon, his curiosity evident. He was a tall man in his 60s, with silver hair and the gentle manner of someone who had spent decades helping students understand the human body and its infinite variations. Maya had the photograph displayed on her large monitor, zoomed in on the child's face. James leaned forward, studying the image carefully. Maya watched his expression change from casual interest to focused attention, then to something like astonishment. "You're seeing what I'm seeing?" Maya asked. James nodded slowly. "If this photograph is authentic and unaltered, and I assume you've verified that, then yes, I'm seeing clear markers of Waardenburg syndrome. Look at the distance between the inner corners of the eyes, what we call dystopia canthorum. And here, do you see this lighter patch in her hair? That would be the characteristic white forelock. But most striking of all," he pointed to the child's eyes, and Maya leaned in closer. "Even through the limitations of the old photograph, even with the remaining imperfections in the restoration, the difference was visible. One eye appeared darker, consistent with the deep brown common in African Americans, but the other eye was distinctly lighter. Not brown, but a pale blue or gray that created a startling contrast. Heterochromia," James said quietly. "Complete heterochromia iridis, different colored eyes. Combined with these other features, it's almost certainly Waardenburg syndrome type 1. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. But Waardenburg syndrome wasn't identified until 1951. This photograph is from 1906. "The condition has always existed," James explained, pulling up a chair. "Petrus Johannes Waardenburg was simply the first to recognize it as a distinct genetic syndrome and publish research about it. Before that, people with these characteristics were just considered unusual or, in some cultures, marked by God or cursed. For a black child in the segregated South in 1906, looking this different from other members of her community," he trailed off, the implications clear. Maya thought about what life must have been like for this little girl. The heterochromia alone would have been startling. Light eyes in a black child, one light and one dark, creating an appearance that would have seemed impossible to people who didn't understand genetics. Add the white forelock, the distinctive facial spacing, and this child would have been unmistakably different. "In 1906, how would people have understood this?" Maya asked. James shook his head. "They wouldn't have. They might have thought she was partially albino, or that she had some white ancestry that manifested in unusual ways. Some might have viewed her with suspicion or fear. Others might have considered her special, blessed, or cursed, depending on their beliefs. And in Charleston, with its rigid racial hierarchies and segregation laws, a black child who looked different in this particular way." He paused. "It would have been complicated, potentially dangerous." Maya returned to her computer and pulled up the letter from Grace Thompson. "The woman who sent me this photograph said it's of her great-great-grandmother's family. She's trying to learn more about them. Should I tell her what we found?" "Absolutely," James said firmly. "This is part of her family's story. But more than that, this could be historically significant." Maya spent the rest of the afternoon completing the restoration, working with new understanding and care now that she knew what she was looking at. She enhanced the details of the child's face carefully, making the distinctive features visible without exaggeration. When she finished, the little girl's face was clear. The wide-set eyes with their striking difference in color, the white streak in her dark hair, the small, serious expression that suggested a child who had already learned she was different. Maya printed 2 copies of the restored photograph, one for Grace Thompson and one for her own files. Then she sat down to write an email, choosing her words carefully. "Dear Ms. Thompson, I have completed the restoration of your family photograph. The image was severely damaged, but I was able to recover most of the detail. However, during the restoration process, I discovered something significant about the youngest child in the photograph. The little girl shows clear physical characteristics of a genetic condition called Waardenburg syndrome, which affects pigmentation and facial structure. This condition wasn't medically identified until 1951, so your ancestors in 1906 wouldn't have had a name for what made this child different. I'm sharing this information with you because it may help you understand more about your family's history. If you'd like to discuss this further, I would be happy to talk with you. I'm also willing to help you research what you can find about this child and what her life might have been like." Maya hesitated before clicking send. She was about to tell a stranger that their ancestor had a genetic condition, information that might be surprising or even distressing. But Grace had asked her to help see the faces clearly, and this was part of that truth. She sent the email, then packaged the restored photograph carefully for shipping. 3 days later, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a Charleston area code. "Ms. Richardson? This is Grace Thompson. I received your email about my great-great-grandmother's family photograph." Grace's voice was warm but emotional. "I've been staring at the restored image for 2 days. The little girl with the different colored eyes, that's my great-great-grandmother. Her name was Sarah. Maya's heart skipped. The child in the photograph grew up? Do you know anything about her life? That's why I'm calling, Grace said. After I read your email, I went through all the family papers I have. Old letters, Bible records, newspaper clippings my grandmother saved. I've been trying to piece together Sarah's story for years, but there are so many gaps. My grandmother never talked much about her own grandmother, and when she did, she was vague. I always wondered why. Now I think I'm starting to understand. What did you find? Maya asked. Grace took a deep breath. I found a letter from 1924, written by Sarah to her daughter, my great-grandmother. In it, she talks about being different all her life, about people treating her with fear or fascination. She mentions a woman named Clara who protected her as a child and taught her everything. I never understood what that meant before, but now? Now you know Sarah had Waardenburg syndrome, Maya finished. And in 1906, Charleston, that would have made her very vulnerable. Ms. Richardson, would you be willing to help me find out more? About Sarah, about this Clara who protected her, about what Sarah's life was really like? I have so many pieces, but I can't fit them together on my own. 2 weeks later, Maya stood in the arrivals area of Charleston International Airport, holding a sign with Grace Thompson's name. She had decided that this story was too important to research from a distance. Grace had invited her to Charleston, offering to share all the family documents she had collected and to introduce Maya to the city where Sarah had grown up. Grace emerged from the crowd, a woman in her early 50s with warm eyes and her great-great-grandmother's high cheekbones. They recognized each other immediately, and Grace pulled Maya into a hug. Thank you for coming, Grace said. I know you didn't have to do this. Restoring the photograph was your job. This is something more. This is history, Maya replied, and I want to help you find it. They drove into Charleston as the afternoon light turned golden, past the elegant historic homes and live oaks draped with Spanish moss. Grace pointed out landmarks as they passed. The old Slave Mart Museum, Mother Emanuel AME Church, the neighborhoods that had been the heart of Black Charleston in the early 20th century. The house in the photograph doesn't exist anymore, Grace explained. It was torn down in the 1950s during urban renewal. But I know the street it was on, and I've been researching what the neighborhood was like in Sarah's time. Grace's home was a modest bungalow in North Charleston, filled with family photographs spanning 5 generations. She had converted her dining room into a research center with a large table covered in organized stacks of documents, a computer, and a whiteboard covered with notes and a hand-drawn family tree. I've been working on this for 3 years, Grace said, gesturing at the organized chaos, ever since my mother died, and I inherited all the family papers she'd been keeping. I always knew our family had interesting stories, but I didn't realize how much history was hidden in these documents. She pulled out a cardboard box and carefully lifted a stack of letters wrapped in ribbon. These are from Sarah. She wrote them to my great-grandmother, her daughter between 1924 and 1948. Sarah died in 1952, when my grandmother was just a teenager. By then, she wasn't talking much about the past anymore. My grandmother said Sarah became quiet in her later years, like she was tired of remembering. Maya took the letters carefully, aware she was holding pieces of Sarah's voice from across the decades. The handwriting was clear and educated, each letter dated and addressed with care. Grace pulled out another document, a small leather-bound book with a broken clasp. This is what made me reach out to you in the first place. I found it in my mother's things after she passed. It's some kind of journal or record book, written by someone named Clara Bennett. It covers the years 1902 to 1928, and Sarah is mentioned throughout. But it's not just a diary. It's full of medical observations, descriptions of treatments, records of births and deaths in the community. I think Clara must have been a midwife or healer. Maya opened the journal carefully. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, each entry dated and detailed. She flipped through randomly and found an entry from August 1906. Sarah continues to thrive despite the talk among some families. Her eyes and hair make her a curiosity, but she is bright and quick to learn. I have convinced her mother to keep her close to home until she is older and stronger. The world is not always kind to those who are different. Maya and Grace spent that evening going through Clara Bennett's journal systematically, reading entries aloud and taking notes. The picture that emerged was of a remarkable woman who had served Charleston's black community as a healer, midwife, and informal physician for nearly 3 decades. Clara had been born in 1870, the daughter of formerly enslaved people who had learned herbal medicine and midwifery during slavery and passed that knowledge to their daughter. By 1902, when the journal began, Clara was 32 years old and had established herself as someone the community trusted with their most vulnerable moments: births, illnesses, deaths. The first mention of Sarah appeared in June 1906, the same month as the family photograph. Delivered Ruth's 5th child today, a girl they named Sarah. The birth was straightforward, but the child's appearance is unusual. Her eyes are two different colors, one dark like her parents', one pale blue like I have never seen in a colored child. There is also a white streak in her hair at the crown. Ruth is frightened, wondering if her baby is cursed. I assured her the child is healthy and whole, just different. I have read of such things in my medical books, though I do not have a name for this particular condition. Your great-great-grandmother was born in 1906, Maya said, looking up from the journal. This entry is from her birth. Grace nodded, tears in her eyes. Clara was there from the beginning. She knew what Sarah was facing, even as an infant. They continued reading. Clara's entries over the following months showed her watching Sarah's development carefully, noting that the child was meeting all normal milestones, sitting up, crawling, responding to sounds and voices. But Clara also recorded the community's reactions. People are talking about Ruth's unusual child. Some say she is marked by God, others whisper darker things. I have spoken to several families, trying to educate them, but superstition runs deep. Ruth keeps Sarah mostly at home, which is wise for now, but cannot last forever. By 1908, when Sarah was 2 years old, the entries showed Clara taking a more active role. I have offered to help educate Sarah when she is older. Ruth is grateful, but worried about how people will react if her daughter learns too much. I reminded her that knowledge is the best protection we can give our children, especially children who will face extra scrutiny for being different. Maya noticed a pattern in the entries. Clara wrote about other children in the community, their illnesses, their growth, their families. But she returned to Sarah again and again, with a level of detail and personal investment that went beyond medical observation. Clara became Sarah's protector, Maya said. She saw something special in her and decided to shield her from the worst of what she would face. Grace pulled out another document, a faded newspaper clipping from the Charleston Messenger, a black-owned newspaper that had operated in the early 20th century. The article was dated 1925 and featured a photograph of a young woman in a nurse's uniform. The headline read, "Local woman completes nursing training." Maya looked at the photograph, then at the restored family portrait from 1906. The same distinctive features, the wide-set eyes, though the heterochromia was less visible in the newspaper's lower-quality reproduction. That's Sarah. That's Sarah, Grace confirmed. She became a nurse. In 1925, in South Carolina, a black woman with a visible genetic condition became a certified nurse. Do you understand how remarkable that is? The next morning, Grace took Maya to the Charleston County Public Library, which housed an extensive collection of historical records and archives related to the city's African-American community. They requested files on Clara Bennett, nursing schools in South Carolina during the 1920s, and records from the neighborhood where Sarah's family had lived. The librarian, an older man named Frederick, who had worked in the archives for 40 years, recognized Grace and greeted her warmly. When Grace explained what they were researching, his expression grew thoughtful. Clara Bennett, he said slowly. I know that name. My grandmother used to talk about a healer woman named Clara who delivered half the babies in the neighborhood. Said she was the smartest person she ever knew, colored or white, man or woman. Taught herself medicine from books when no school would admit her. He disappeared into the back rooms and returned with several boxes of materials. These are records from the Cannon Street Hospital and Training School for Nurses. It was one of the few institutions in South Carolina that trained black nurses in the 1920s. If your ancestor trained as a nurse, her records might be here. Maya and Grace spent hours going through admission records, training rosters, and graduation lists. Finally, Grace found it. Sarah admitted. September 1922, sponsored by Clara Bennett, graduated May 1925 with honors. Special commendation for dedication to patient care. Sponsored by Clara Bennett, Maya read aloud. So Clara not only protected and educated Sarah as a child, she made it possible for her to become a nurse. They found more in Clara's journal entries from 1922. Sarah has been accepted to the nursing school. I used every contact and favor I had accumulated over 30 years to make this happen. The administrators were hesitant. Sarah's appearance makes her memorable and not always in comfortable ways. But her intelligence and determination won them over. She will face challenges there that other students will not face. People will stare at her eyes, whisper about her difference. But Sarah has lived her whole life being stared at. She knows how to meet the world with dignity. Frederick brought them another set of records, employment files from the Charleston County Health Department. The health department started hiring black nurses in the mid-1920s to work in colored communities. If your ancestor worked in Charleston after graduation, there might be records. They found Sarah's name in employment records from 1926. Sarah, registered nurse, assigned to home visits in the East Side community. Monthly salary, $45. Frederick pulled out a map of Charleston from the 1920s and pointed to an area that had been predominantly black and poor. The East Side, that was rough territory. Poor sanitation, overcrowded housing, limited access to health care. The nurses who worked there were going into homes, where they might find anything from tuberculosis to malnutrition to untreated injuries. It took courage. Grace found a letter in Sarah's correspondence that gave context to those years. Written in 1927 to her daughter, who was just a baby at the time, it read, "I visit families today who look at me with suspicion at first. My eyes make them uncertain. But when I help deliver a healthy baby, or treat a child's fever, or show a mother how to keep her family well, they forget about my difference. They see me as someone who cares. Clara taught me that the best way to overcome prejudice is to be undeniably good at what you do." On their third day in Charleston, Grace took Maya to the cemetery where Sarah was buried. It was a small, well-maintained African-American cemetery on the outskirts of the city, with graves dating back to the late 1800s. Sarah's headstone was simple but carefully engraved. Sarah, 1906, 1952, beloved mother, grandmother, and healer. They stood in silence for a moment. Maya thought about the arc of Sarah's life, born visibly different in a time and place that punished difference, protected and educated by a remarkable woman who saw her potential, trained as a nurse against significant odds, and spending her career caring for the community's most vulnerable members. "I found one more thing," Grace said quietly. She pulled out a small wooden box from her bag. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, was a tarnished silver pin in the shape of a nurse's cap. This was Sarah's nursing pin from her graduation. My grandmother gave it to me before she died. She said Sarah wore it every day she worked, even after it went out of style. She said it reminded Sarah of what she had overcome to earn it. Maya photographed the pin carefully, adding it to the growing documentation of Sarah's life. As she worked, an elderly woman approached them, walking slowly with a cane. She looked at the headstone, then at Grace. "You're Sarah's family?" the woman asked. Grace nodded. "Her great-great-granddaughter. Did you know her?" "Child, Sarah delivered me," the woman said with a gentle smile. "December 1949. I was born 2 months early, and the doctors at the colored hospital said I wouldn't make it. But Sarah came to our house every day for 6 weeks, checking on me, teaching my mama how to care for a premature baby. She saved my life." The woman's name was Dorothy, and she was 74 years old. She had lived her entire life in Charleston and remembered Sarah's visits to the neighborhood in the late 1940s and early 1950s. "People called her the nurse with angel eyes," Dorothy said, "because one of her eyes was light like heaven, or that's what folks said. She was patient and kind, never rushed. She'd sit with families for hours if they needed her, explaining things, making sure they understood how to care for themselves." Dorothy paused, looking at the headstone. "But I remember she was sad sometimes. My mama said Sarah had lived through things that would have broken most people. Being different in a world that didn't understand difference, losing her husband young, working herself near to exhaustion, trying to help people. But she never stopped caring." Maya asked if Dorothy would be willing to be interviewed on camera about her memories of Sarah. Dorothy agreed readily. Sarah's story should be told. She was remarkable, and people have forgotten. Young people today need to know what it took for folks like Sarah to survive and succeed. That evening, Maya set up her camera equipment in Grace's living room, and Dorothy returned to share her memories on film. She talked about Sarah's gentle manner, her competence, the way she commanded respect even from people who might have otherwise dismissed a black woman nurse. She talked about the medicine bag Sarah carried, always organized and clean, and the way Sarah would explain medical procedures in terms families could understand. Maya spent her last 2 days in Charleston conducting additional interviews with elderly community members who remembered Sarah or had heard stories about her from their parents. A pattern emerged in their testimonies. Sarah had been unusual in appearance but remarkable in character, someone who turned her difference into a kind of strength. One man, 91-year-old Robert, remembered his mother talking about how Sarah had persisted in her nursing training despite being told by some administrators that her appearance would make patients uncomfortable. But Mama said once people met Sarah, once they saw how much she cared and how good she was at her job, they forgot about her eyes being different colors. They just saw her skill and kindness. Another woman, Patricia, had inherited photographs from her grandmother that showed Sarah at a community health fair in 1948, teaching mothers about nutrition and childhood diseases. In the photographs, Sarah stood at a table covered with educational materials, surrounded by women listening intently. Her distinctive eyes were visible, but what struck Maya was her confident posture, her direct gaze at the camera, the sense of someone completely comfortable in her role despite a lifetime of being different. Maya also discovered records showing that Sarah had continued working as a nurse until just 6 months before her death in 1952. She had been 46 years old when she died, relatively young, and the death certificate listed heart failure as the cause. Clara's journal, which continued until 1928, had made several references to Sarah's health, noting that she pushed herself too hard and often neglected her own well-being while caring for others. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Grace's cousin, who lived in Colombia, heard about the research and contacted them with a box of materials that had belonged to his mother, Sarah's daughter. Inside was a collection of letters Sarah had written to her daughter in the 1940s, when the daughter was away at college. The letters were intimate and revealing. Sarah wrote about her work, about the families she cared for, about the challenges of being a black nurse in a segregated healthcare system. But she also wrote about her childhood, about growing up different and the fear that had shadowed her early years. In a letter from 1946, Sarah wrote, "I want you to understand something about being different, about having people stare at you and whisper. When I was young, Clara taught me that difference can be either a burden or a gift, depending on how you choose to carry it. I chose to let it make me more compassionate, more determined to help others who also feel like outsiders. My eyes that made people uncomfortable as a child became my trademark as a nurse. People remembered me, trusted me, knew I would come when they needed help. The very thing that could have limited me became part of my strength." Maya recorded this letter on camera, with Grace reading it aloud. It seemed to capture the essence of Sarah's journey. From a child who must have felt isolated and frightened, protected by a remarkable healer who saw her potential, to a woman who built a career helping others despite facing obstacles most people couldn't imagine. On Maya's last evening in Charleston, she and Grace compiled everything they had discovered into a comprehensive timeline of Sarah's life, supported by documents, photographs, and oral testimonies. The story that emerged was extraordinary. A child born with Waardenburg syndrome in 1906, South Carolina, raised in segregation, protected and educated by a community healer, trained as a nurse despite her visible difference, and dedicating her life to caring for the most vulnerable members of her community. 3 months after Maya returned to Brooklyn, she stood in the Charleston Museum during the opening reception for an exhibition titled Hidden Faces, Revealed Lives, the story of Sarah and Clara Bennett. The restored 1906 family photograph held the central position, displayed on a large panel with detailed enhancements showing Sarah's distinctive features clearly. Beside the photograph was Clara's journal, open to the entry, describing Sarah's birth. On another wall hung the letter where Sarah reflected on turning her difference into strength. There were photographs of Sarah as a young nurse, records from her training, testimonies from the people she had helped, and a timeline that showed how an unidentified genetic condition in 1906 had shaped the trajectory of a remarkable life. Grace stood beside Maya, surrounded by family members, cousins, nieces, nephews, great-grandchildren of Sarah's siblings. The exhibition had brought together branches of the family that hadn't been in contact for decades, all connected by this ancestor whose story had been partially hidden for generations. Dr. James Wright had contributed a detailed medical panel explaining Waardenburg syndrome, its genetic basis, its characteristics, and why it wouldn't be identified until 1951. He emphasized that people with this condition throughout history had often been misunderstood, sometimes feared or ostracized, but that the condition itself didn't affect intelligence or capability, only appearance. The exhibition also honored Clara Bennett, whose journal had preserved so much of the story. Research had revealed that Clara had delivered more than 800 babies during her career, trained dozens of women in midwifery and herbal medicine, and quietly challenged the medical establishment by demonstrating that black women could practice healthcare with skill and knowledge, even when formal training was denied to them. A local filmmaker who had attended the opening approached Grace about creating a documentary. A medical historian from Duke University wanted to include Sarah's story in a book about the history of genetic conditions in African American communities. A nursing school in Charleston expressed interest in creating a scholarship in Sarah's name for students from underrepresented backgrounds. As the evening progressed, Dorothy, the woman Sarah had helped deliver in 1949, stood before the central. "When I sent that damaged photograph to Maya for restoration, I just wanted to see my ancestors' faces clearly. I never imagined what we would discover, or how many lives Sarah had touched. For generations, our family knew she had been a nurse, but we didn't know her full story. We didn't know about Clara, who protected and educated her. We didn't know about the genetic condition that made her different, or how she transformed that difference into a strength. We didn't know how many people she had helped, how many lives she had saved." Grace paused, looking at the photograph of 4-year-old Sarah with her striking eyes and serious expression. Sarah grew up in a time when being different was dangerous, when being a black woman meant facing constant limitations, when pursuing education and a career in nursing required courage most of us can't imagine. But she did it anyway, supported by people like Clara who saw her worth. This exhibition honors not just Sarah, but all the people in our communities who have been remarkable in quiet ways, whose stories deserve to be remembered and celebrated. Maya watched as visitors moved through the exhibition, stopping to read the documents, study the photographs, and absorb the story of a woman who had been born different in 1906 and had turned that difference into a lifetime of service. The restoration of a single damaged photograph had revealed not just faces, but an entire hidden history of resilience, courage, and determination. Several elderly attendees approached the staff during the evening with stories of their own family members who had been different in some way, physically, mentally, socially. and had faced similar challenges in earlier generations. The exhibition had opened a conversation about difference, disability, and the ways communities had historically both rejected and embraced those who didn't fit expected patterns. As the reception concluded, Maya stood once more before the restored photograph. She thought about the moment she had first zoomed in on Sarah's face and seen those distinctive features, the shock of recognizing a genetic condition that shouldn't have been visible in a 1906 photograph because no one in that era would have known what they were looking at. But people had seen it. Sarah's family, her community, Clara Bennett, they had seen that this child was different, and they had made choices about how to respond. Some had been frightened or superstitious, but others, crucially, had chosen to protect and nurture Sarah, to give her education and opportunity, to help her become someone who would spend her life helping others. The photograph was no longer just a damaged artifact that needed restoration. It had become a window into a hidden history, a testament to the power of one person's determination and the community that supported her. 4-year-old Sarah, sitting on those porch steps in 1906 with her different colored eyes and white forelock, had grown into a woman who delivered babies, treated illnesses, saved lives, and earned the respect of everyone who knew her. Her face, frozen in time at age 4, had held a secret that took more than a century to fully understand. But now that secret was revealed, and Sarah's story of difference, determination, and dedicated service would not be forgotten again, Grace approached Maya as the museum began to close. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for seeing what was hidden in that photograph and caring enough to help me find the truth. Sarah deserves to be remembered." Maya embraced her. "Thank you for trusting me with your family's story, and thank you for being willing to share it with the world. There are probably thousands of other people like Sarah, whose stories are hidden in damaged photographs and forgotten documents. Maybe this will inspire others to look more carefully at their own family histories." As Maya flew back to Brooklyn the next day, she thought about the restoration work waiting for her at the studio. Dozens of damaged photographs from families hoping to see their ancestors' faces clearly. She wondered how many other hidden stories were waiting to be discovered, how many other remarkable lives had been partially erased by time, damage, and deliberate forgetting. Sarah's story had started with a badly damaged photograph and ended with a museum exhibition, a community reconnected with its history, and a woman's legacy finally honored. But for Maya, it reinforced something she had always believed, that every photograph was more than just an image. Every photograph was a story, and behind every face was a life that deserved to be seen, understood, and remembered. The photograph of 4-year-old Sarah with her remarkable eyes would continue to hang in the Charleston Museum, visible to generations who would never meet her but could learn from her strength. And somewhere in Charleston, elderly people who had been children when Sarah delivered them or treated their childhood illnesses would tell their grandchildren about the nurse with angel eyes who had refused to let being different stop her from being extraordinary.